Hi, I'm Chuck Bonner, and I'm going to show you how to make a pumpkin pie pretty much from scratch. This is part one of a 2.5-part series. What we're going to do here in part one is make pumpkin puree. Later on we'll get to the actual pies. Later on I'll explain what I mean by pretty much from scratch. I believe it was Dr. Carl Sagan said, in order to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. Well, we're not going back that far because we're not making apple pie, we're making pumpkin pie. Okay, first thing you want to do when you're making a pumpkin pie from scratch is find a recipe. I searched high and low for a recipe that didn't start with prepared canned pumpkin pie filling. I wanted to start with a pumpkin. Finally found one about 20 years ago or so. There was this newfangled thing called the World Wide Web, and I found a recipe. Then I modified it, made it my own. I'll give credit where credit is due. This began as Fifi's pumpkin pie recipe, maple pumpkin pie #1, I believe. But I've modified it, so now it's my recipe. So if anything goes wrong, you're okay, Fifi, it's not your fault. Okay, after you have a recipe you can work with, next thing you want is a pumpkin. I have 2 sugar pumpkins here in front of me. The difference between a sugar pumpkin and a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin is mostly size. We might want to pretend that the sugar pumpkin is specially bred to be sweeter and meatier and all that. In my experience, I don't think it's true. I have made pumpkin pies from jack-o'-lantern pumpkins and they were just fine. I have bought little sugar pumpkins like this that were nearly as hard as wood, and the meat of them was very, very thin, very, very hard. But once I cooked it and pureed it, it was just fine. Couldn't tell the difference. Maybe it's just because I'm not that good of a cook, but I can't tell any consistent way to pick a good sugar pumpkin for making pies. What you want to do when you go to the grocery store, pick it up, look it over carefully, thump it and listen to it. That makes the other people in the grocery store think that you really know what you're doing. They're all the same. Pumpkin pies, or pumpkins by the way, are pretty much like a box of chocolates. You leave them sitting around too long, they get all gooshed in on the bottom and nobody will admit to having done it. So, we're going to try and see what we get out of these pumpkins. By the way, I have a little special trick this year. Out in the woods near my house, there's a hollow tree, little family of gnomes. Old Grandpa Gnome, he likes to sip a little bit, so I persuaded him to make me a magic wand in exchange for a bottle of whiskey. If this works, I got a great deal here. Sure, you may say it's a stick, but Grandpa Gnome, well, he was a little bit tipsy when he made this, so let's see what happens. Coach. Turned the pumpkin into a coach, you see. Okay, that didn't work out so well. Let's try again. There it is. Honey, I found the remote. Now we're out of pumpkins. Let's see what we can do here. Maybe if I hold this thing backward. What could it hurt, right? Cool? Okay, let's do it the hard way. Remember to hold that thing backward, pumpkin. Okay, so what do we want to do now? I want to get my cutting board, my knife, and start cutting. Okay, got my cutting board, got my knife. Now there's a right way to do this. I've been making pumpkin pies for over 20 years. I haven't found the right way to do it yet, but I'll see what I can do. I'll start by cutting out the stem area because the pith inside the stem area is too hard and fibrous to use anyway. So just cut. Ow. I'll try not to hurt myself. It wasn't the knife that got me, it was the stem. 360 degrees in this pumpkin. Okay. Trash bag off camera here. This looks like a very thick-walled pumpkin, which is good. You get lots of puree out of it. And now just kind of cut it top to bottom. I'm using a filleting knife for the whole job. Some people might recommend a carving knife. I don't see much difference because you can't cut a pumpkin straight anyway. I'm cutting through that little thingy on the opposite side of the stem. That's a little bit tough. By the way, I mentioned that pumpkins are all different. I have had them that were hard as wood. Did I mention that? A sugar pumpkin, hard as wood. The wall was very, very thin. I didn't get much pulp out of it, but what I got was fine. This one looks like it has a very nice thick wall. Looks like we get actually quite a lot of pumpkin puree out of this. My recipe, the base recipe, calls for 1.5 cups of pumpkin puree. So the amount of pumpkins you need to make the number of pies you want, you never know. Like a box of chocolates. Okay, oh, got a little cookie tray here I'm putting the seeds in. We'll get to that in part 1.5 of this series. So now I've got the pumpkin cut in halves. I'm going to cut it into wedges. Don't know exactly how big they are. This isn't a very precise science. It's more of an art. And we'll get back to that a little bit later too. Pumpkin guts, seeds, now I'm going to scrape the seeds into my cookie tray here. I'm not going to pay too much attention to what happens to the pumpkin guts. Just put it all together in a heap. Now I'm going to slice this wedge in half, like that. End up with something like this. Now I'm just going to scrape that pumpkin boogers out of there. One more seed. The boogers are going to go into here. Ordinarily I would just scrape, but now I'm actually cut a little bit of the pumpkin pith with that, but not too worried about it. Scraped a little bit of residue of booger here, and there's my pumpkin wedge that I'm going to cook. I'm checking to see if I got any of the stem part here because that's going to be too hard. I'm going to put it into the pumpkin pie dish here, but I'm not making pie yet. We're just making puree. Found a little bit of stray boogers there. Yeah, there's a little bit more. Okay, and I'm going to continue in this manner till I have somewhere around ½ pound worth of pumpkin, and then I'll put it into the microwave. I'll stop the camera, stop wasting your bandwidth watching me cut these wedges. This is what I'm making, you see? Turn the whole pumpkin into these at this stage. Okay, so I've given my entire pumpkin a giant wedgie, turned it into, I can't even count that high, I run out of fingers, but a whole bunch of wedges. I got about ½ pound here in a pie plate. Yeah, about ½ pound. So now I'm going to start cooking in the microwave before I puree it. Now, you might like to think of cookery as a precise thing. You measure precisely, you time precisely, you set the temperature precisely, and everything works just right. It isn't. The pumpkin varies in thickness, it varies in moisture content. The slices that you've made are non-uniform in size and thickness and all that. Microwaves vary. You always see that in the microwave instructions. Your power may vary and all that stuff. So you just have to let go of the idea of precision and go with your feelings. Luke, use the forks. So I'm going to microwave this about like you would a baked potato. I'm going to start off with about 6 minutes. Usually it takes a little bit more than that, but a little bit less is better. And I can poke it with the forks, and if it still feels hard, I'll give it another half a minute or a minute, depending on what it feels like. So, let's go pop them into the microwave. Microwave popping. You see my microwave has one of those roundy things. If yours doesn't, you might want to turn the pumpkin about every minute during the cooking. Notice, by the way, I should warn you, it's set to 2004 for the time. This is a 14.75 amp microwave plugged into a 15 amp circuit breaker. Every now and then, when we start it, it pops the breaker, resets the clock to 24-hour mode. I don't even bother resetting the time because it pops the breaker so often. Doesn't matter, I just need to cook for 6 minutes and then I'll check it with the forks. Didn't pop the breaker. Okay, we'll be back in 6 minutes. While the microwave was doing its thing, I went and got my wife's favorite mixing bowl. We've had this thing since the Carter administration. It's had kind of a rough life. We use it for everything. Pumpkin puree, bathing small children, mixing cement, whatever. So now I'm just going to sit here and consume some of your bandwidth while we wait for the microwave to beep. Got about 2¼ minutes to go. Didn't time that well. Oh, by the way, we got one pumpkin going here, but I'm going to do a second one too. I'm going to get a whole lot of pumpkin puree. Make lots of pies this year. What I do, I make the puree in advance. It's middle of October now, and I put it in the freezer. And then I can pull it out whenever I want to make pumpkin pies for Thanksgiving or for Christmas. It keeps for months in the freezer. Put it in an airtight plastic container. So I mentioned I had 2 pumpkins. No, I didn't turn the remote back into a pumpkin. I'm hanging on to that. But I found this behind the cushions of the sofa. Got another 1.5 minutes to go. I got time. Your bandwidth. There it is. Okay, let's see what we got. Just by the look of it, it ain't done. No, still very hard. This is unusual, but this is the thickest pumpkin I've ever tried in the microwave. I think I'm going to give it about another, yeah. What do we like? 4? Sure. You could just kind of pause for about 4 minutes. I'm not going to bother. Beep. Oh yeah. Nice. Oh yeah, I'm not even pointing the camera at it, but it's nice. Nice and soft and gushy. I can work with that. Okay, let's bring it to the table and get to work. Okay, now I don't really know if I'm going to catch this action on the camera. What I'm going to do, if you can see, I'm going to take the skin off. I'm going to use the spoon to kind of hold the thing in place while I start the fork in there. Separate the pith from the skin, oh yeah. And then the skin comes right off, mostly. You might want to leave a few shreds of this skin in there so that you can more easily convince your friends that you made this pumpkin pie out of an actual pumpkin. Now, I don't need to do that for 2 reasons. One, I have video evidence that I made the pumpkin pie with an actual pumpkin. And 2, I don't have any friends. In case you have friends who like to make pumpkin pie with prepared pie filling, maybe you could give them some of this skin to put into their pies so they can try to convince people that they made it from an actual pumpkin. The one thing you might notice about this pumpkin, it's much lighter in color than the prepared pie filling. The pies we're going to end up with are much lighter in color than the typical commercial pumpkin pie you might buy in the grocery store. I think there's at least two explanations for that. One is food coloring, and another is the pumpkin in the pumpkin pie filling isn't necessarily pumpkin. They could use almost any kind of winter squash and call it pumpkin pie filling, and some of it is much darker than this actual pumpkin. Now when they do that, they're not actually lying to us, because the definition of pumpkin is kind of vague. Pumpkin is just a squash. Here in America, we call a large squash with an orange skin a pumpkin, but in other parts of the world, almost any winter squash might be called a pumpkin. I almost picked it up with my hand. I mentioned, I think, this is very, very hot. It can't burn you, because you're just watching a video. It can burn me, so I have to be careful. Okay. We're not done yet. This isn't puree. This is just cooked pumpkin. But I got a whole bunch more wedges to do the same treatment. I do need to take them out of the skin while they're hot. But if I were really smart and arranged my workplace just right, I could take these and be scraping them while the next batch is cooking. But I'm not all that smart. In all the 20 years that I've been making pumpkin pies, 20 or more, I found that the ideal arrangement for my workspace is completely beyond me. Haven't hit it yet. Haven't really tried much. This works. It's not like I have a production quota to meet. I don't think. Oh yeah, another thing that this bowl that I wanted to tell you we use it for blocking mind control beams. It's not quite as effective as aluminum foil, but it's much more durable. And I've had this thing since the Carter administration. Nobody's controlling my thoughts, not even me. With enough for that, let's go do some more stuff. I'll turn the camera off while I turn the rest of the wedges into this pumpkin mush. There's a piece of skin here that's bothering me. Okay. Bother me no more. Okay, so I'll turn the camera off while I do the rest of this stuff. Okay, cooking's done. Time to turn this mess of cooked pumpkin into puree. Look at that. I am amazed at how much pumpkin stuff, whatever you call this, I got out of that pumpkin pre-stuff. This one pumpkin has given me all the pumpkin puree I'm going to need for this year. I don't know what I'll do with the extra one. We'll think of something. So that's the thing. Pumpkins are like a box of chocolates. Try and explain that to your significant other when you give her a pumpkin on Valentine's Day. Okay, so now we need to puree this mess. I don't have a good place to put my spoon. Like I said, still haven't figured out the best way to arrange my workspace. Put the spoon on the cutting board there. Get my mixer. What do you call it? Mixer, blender, whatever you call it. One thing about using a mixer with this cooked pumpkin, see how the blades spin? It goes in this side, out this side. Try to keep that angle down so that all the splatter goes into the bowl. Another thing about it, you really can't talk over it, so just listen to the music of the mixer, beater, blender, whatever you call this thing. You're probably going to want to see this action, but I don't want to splatter the camera too much. I'll see what I can rig, because this mess of cooked pumpkin is going to turn into a puree, pasty kind of stuff. You'll see it happen. Maybe you won't see the whole process, but you'll see it when it's done. I'll show you the difference between what I'm mixing and what I'm going to end up with. Okay, maybe this will give us what I want to show you. Look at what I got. been mixing at a low speed for maybe a minute, and you can see it's got a pretty good texture. Not quite a puree yet, but this didn't take long at all. When I used to do this the old-fashioned way, pre-microwave, it took a long time to get it even to this consistency, and another couple of minutes to get a real puree out of it. But I'm going to turn the mixer on high speed now, and we're going to start some real puree and stuff. Oops. I always like to hold the beaters up out of the mixture for a while to shake most of the junk off. Now I'm just going to scrape the bowl down into the middle. This is pretty much puree. See that? Looks like what you might get in a can of prepared pumpkin pie filling, except it's not that weird dark orange color. Scraping the edges of the bowl here, I get in some of the stuff that kind of escaped the beater, blender, mixer thing. Give it a chance to turn into puree. Look at that. Nice. Tastes good too. Pumpkin-y. No spices in it yet, but that comes in the pie. That's what you want to see. Okay, put the camera back into wide view mode again. Okay, what I'm going to do now is, without making too much of a mess, put this pumpkin puree into my little plastic containers, and I'll freeze it for a few weeks. A couple weeks now I'll be making the Thanksgiving pies. This is October right now, it'll be more than a couple weeks. Several weeks from now, I'll be making Thanksgiving pumpkin pies, and I'll still have some puree left to make Christmas pumpkin pies too. Like I said, I don't have any friends. Over the bowl. See, I have learned a few things over the years. I could put it all into one giant container, but that would mean thawing it all when I only want to use half of it. So I'm going to put it into several small containers, about one batch worth in each container. Now, I think I mentioned the main recipe calls for a cup and a half. Lost a little. So the main recipe is a cup and a half of pumpkin puree, and that makes about 2 pies. But I've got almost 3 cups here. So I'll just proportion the batch. The whole batching is driven by the pumpkin puree. How much puree you got, that's going to dictate how much of the other ingredients you're going to use. But we'll get to that in part 2. Well, that wraps up making pumpkin puree. I got it all tucked away in the freezer, ready for part 1 and a half of this 2.5 part series. When we get to part 2, that's where we'll be actually making the pumpkin pies. Part 1 and a half, I'll just show you what to do with the pumpkin seeds. But when we get to the pumpkin pies, that's where I'll explain how the amount of pumpkin puree you ended up with will dictate how much of the other ingredients you need. I start with the base recipe at 1.5 cups of pumpkin puree, but since I'll be making a bigger batch, I'll proportion all the other ingredients according to how much puree I have. Like I said, I have now more pumpkin puree than I need for this year. So what am I going to do with this other pumpkin? I have an idea. And I have a magic wand. I'll turn it into something that I really need. Dang.